Hi, everybody. This is Professor Whitman. It's week 5, and we are now getting into business buying behavior. Last week, we learned about consumer buying behavior. And so this week, we're going to switch it up a bit and talk about the business side of things with this short lecture. So business to consumer, B2C, or business to business, B2B markets are very, very different. In business to consumer markets, it's fewer transactions, maybe a lot of transactions, but smaller dollars, shorter decision cycles, whereas business consumers tend to buy at much higher volumes, and it's a lot more money. So the purchasing decisions and that kind of thing, it's a longer process on the business side. So here is a sampling of the type of buyers you see in the business-to-business market. There are producers who are buying raw materials and items to create their final goods or services. Then the resellers resell those items. Costco is a good example of a reseller, although Costco does now have its own line, but basically it's retailers, taking things other people have made and selling them. Governments are huge. They're huge business-to-business buyers. The United States has, I think, some of the largest contracts in this area in the world. It's the world's largest buyer of goods and services. But it's very complex because each agency has its own hierarchy, decision authority, purchase requirements, that kind of thing. So it can be a little bit onerous to sell to the government, because of the fact that they have all of those different requirements. There's hurdles you have to get through. Usually it's a bidding process. The lowest bid doesn't always win. So there's other things involved. And some businesses don't want to deal with it because it is so complicated, but there are those that prevail, and it's very lucrative, and it can be good for long-term contracts. Think of Lockheed Martin or a Raytheon with the defense industry. They're selling straight to the government. And so those are obviously very high ticket item, long production process items that they're purchasing. Finally, we have institutions. They can be nonprofits. I don't know why I have holding costs down 3 times on this slide, but holding costs down is very important because institutions typically have a smaller budget than other business entities. I'm thinking of nonprofits, for example, a homeless shelter. They're going to be buying large quantities of food and hygiene products, very similar to business to consumer, but in larger volumes. And so it's very important to keep the costs down, because if the costs go out of control or get too high, they can't serve as many people. So that's the differentiation here with institutions. Who makes the purchase decisions? Sometimes it can be difficult to find out, and it's usually more than one person involved, sometimes a lot of different people involved, and there's definitely a lot of folks who have influence over the final purchase decision. There's different tiers of people. It's important to try to find the person that has the buying authority, but again, it's typically, the larger the organization, the less likely it is that it's just one person who has that authority. Other buying influencers are the initiators. They're the people who see the need for the product. The users, obviously, they may not have a say in the final product decision making, but they certainly have input at the outset. For example, let's say it's a small office and they're going to find some kind of software to connect the entire office. And they've narrowed it down between Microsoft Office and Slack, let's say. The users of these products may, people in the office might have a lot of input on that, but they do not have the final authority. And finally, there's influencers. There's people who have the ear of management that can put in a good word or a negative one, thus affecting purchase outcome. Gatekeepers, deciders. For very large purchases that are really expensive, it might be the CEO, but generally it's purchasing managers, and it could be a team of folks as well. The dynamics of business-to-business marketing are different, very different from that of business to consumer. There are, again, as we mentioned, a lot of folks involved when there is a business-to-business purchasing decision being made. And generally, there is a much more personal touch that goes into it in terms of selling. Think of your larger contracts. I mentioned Lockheed and Raytheon. They have people that work directly with the different agencies to get specs, to bid out on these projects, and to fine tune products. So they have personal relationships there. On a much smaller scale, I have some colleagues, one who will be speaking to our class later this semester, Shannon Smith. She works in the titling agencies, which titling is, the people who handle your paperwork when you buy or sell a house, all those lovely things you get to sign 8 million times. Well, they actually sell those services to realtors. So it's a business to business market. And they're out there saying, hey, why don't you do all of the titling with your clients through our firm, because we'll take care of you. And so that personal touch is incredibly important, building those relationships. And going on now to, I thought the next slide was e-commerce, but we're going to go into the B2B buying process. You'll notice that it is very similar in some respects to the business to consumer buying process, but it gets a little more complex as you get further down the chart where you're making those decisions. So again, this is where more people are involved. There could be requirements, procurement issues, that kind of thing. And you see that in business to business, which is a lot different from business to consumer. E-commerce is revolutionizing business to business as well. We've seen business to consumer e-marketing really take off in the form of basically every retailer and Amazon and that kind of thing. But e-commerce exists for business to business as well. And while e-commerce makes it so that the sellers don't need to be physically close to the buyers, there's still a personal relationship that comes into play here. It's much more built on one-on-one and having that personal touch to address questions and issues as they come up. Content marketing. Content marketing is, they've listed this as a specific issue for business to business marketing, but really content marketing applies to all marketing. You see it on social media all the time. Really what it is you have determined who your target market is. Again, those folks that are most likely to have a need for or a want of your product. So rather than using a shotgun approach where you basically spend a lot of money to reach a lot of people, but only a handful of them are actually your target market, you're wasting money. So once you've figured out where your target market is, who they are, and how to reach them, content marketing can be it's a really great way to target your messages to them to get them to make that buying decision. And you see this business to consumer, you see it a lot, but you also see it in the business to business world as well. Artificial intelligence plays a big role. You see it at home with Siri on your phone, Alexa, that kind of thing. But artificial intelligence has the capability of revolutionizing business to business and marketing. There are already programs out there that you can put in some keywords and it'll come up with copy for you. So that's, for marketing purposes. So that's going to affect marketing and the marketer's job a great deal. So artificial intelligence in 5 years, I think it's going to look completely different than it does now. And it's going to be ever more a part of this buying process. It might automate certain features of it and speed things up. But really the sky's the limit with artificial intelligence with some caveats. One of your marketing in real life assignments has an article about AI that kind of went bad due to the way it was programmed. So it's something to bear in mind that AI is a wonderful opportunity, but we need to be careful with it. So that concludes this brief overview of business buying behavior. If you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can always post in the instructor's virtual office. I subscribe to that and try to get back as soon as I get a notification. You can email me or call me. Always, you can text me as well, but I do ask that you tell me who you are and what class you're in because I'm teaching several classes this semester. And finally, if you would like a one-on-one with me, you can sign up for an office hours appointment. The link is in the important links box on our D2L homepage. If you have any questions, look forward to hearing from you. See you next time. Bye-bye.